Welcome, everyone, to the New York Public Library and the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. Please silence your cell phones. Thanks for coming to help launch the new book of poems by Cullman Center fellow Gregory Pardlo, Spectral Evidence, published by Alfred A. Knopf today. He will be joined in conversation by National Book Award-winning writer and Harvard professor Imani Perry. My name is Salvatore Scabona. I'm the Weinberg Director of the Cullman Center. As many of you know, the Cullman Center selects 15 fellows a year for a 9-month term. Fellows receive an office in the center, which is in there. They receive enhanced access to our collections and a stipend so they can focus exclusively on their own work during their fellowships. The fellows are some of the best dramatists, artists, nonfiction writers, poets, independent scholars, academics, playwrights, and journalists at work today. They come here from around the country and the world to use the unparalleled collections housed at this library to write the books of tomorrow. The Cullman Center was founded in 1999, and this last September we welcomed our 25th annual class of fellows. This series of conversations presents the books that fellows of the Cullman Center came here to write, and you'll see in the shelves around you copies of those books. Gregory and Imani will talk together for about 35 to 40 minutes, then they'll move on to your questions. If you'd like to pose a question, please write it on the index card that's on your seat. Staff members will walk along the outside aisles to collect your questions in about 30 minutes. This event is being live streamed on YouTube. If you're joining us virtually, please share your questions either in the chat or by emailing cullmancenter@nypl.org. In a starred review of Spectral Evidence, Publishers Weekly observes that, quote, with characteristic intelligence, Pardlo confronts uncomfortable and enduring truths. And Booklist, in another starred review, says each poem demands to be read on a granular level. Form, lyricism, and imagery are expertly presented, and the result is a compelling, cohesive collection addressing timely topics, a beautiful addition to Pardlo's already impressive oeuvre. Copies of Spectral Evidence are for sale, or will be for sale, in the hall. Gregory has kindly agreed to sign them for you. And now to business. Our two speakers tonight are Imani Perry. She's the author of South to America, winner of the 2022 National Book Award for Nonfiction. She is the Henry A. Morse Jr. and Elizabeth W. Morse Professor of Studies of Women, Gender, and Sexuality and of African and American Studies at Harvard University. Her other books include Looking for Lorraine, The Radiant and Radical Life of Lorraine Hansberry, winner of the 2019 Bogred Weld Biography Prize from the PEN America Foundation, Breathe, A Letter to My Sons, Vexy Thing on Gender and Liberation, and May We Forever Stand, A History of the Black National Anthem. Gregory Pardlo's collection, Digest, won the 2015 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. Other honors include fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the New York Foundation for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Arts. Pardlo is poetry editor at the Virginia Quarterly Review and director of the MFA program at Rutgers University Camden. His most recent book is Air Traffic, a memoir in essays. He researched spectral evidence during his Cullman Center Fellowship here from 2020 to 2021. Please welcome Gregory Pardlo and Imani Perry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone. I want to begin by saying it's just such a delight to be in conversation with you about this absolutely extraordinary book. And I was thinking about how what I sort of would say as a way of a means of introduction, and this sentence kept coming to me: "There's a specter haunting America, and it is us." Meaning Black people. And what you trace is the way the sort of spectral evidence or the sort of conception of threat, of demonic, impact, presence, outsized power, danger, how it actually functions in a way that has legal force. It actually does have an evidentiary role in our social arrangements. And as the reviews say, you do so with such extraordinary precision and elegance and incisiveness, but it is a haunting. And it starts with Tituba. Can you talk of the Black Witch of Salem?
Yeah. Thank you, first of all. I am humbled and a little nervous sitting up here alongside you. I have such admiration.
Okay.
Just want to get that out of the way.
All right, whatever you say.
So Tituba, yeah, I was fascinated by the fact that she survived, at least survived immediately, the trial. There was a concerted effort to pin everything on her, right?
Yeah.
She was the catalyst of it. And we think about, American, at least witches in the American context, in a very, well, frankly, white way, right? But at the heart of that was this Black woman. And so I was just fascinated with her as a historical figure and one that, honestly, I hadn't known about until I started researching the book. I know I sense that a lot of people know about her and I've done a lot of work thinking about her, present company included. But yeah, I just wanted to dig in somewhere. She was the catalyst for thinking about Blackness at the center of this haunting that you're talking about. Yeah.
And you talked about, though, that the part of your process of being here as a fellow, moving from that project, because for folks who don't know yet, but I mean, all of the figures who have, in some ways, animated our sense of race and racial injustice in the past, over the past decade, are present in this text, and the harrowing details of what happened with Trayvon Martin and George Floyd and Tamir Rice. Their stories are here. Can you talk about how you move from? I mean, and the book moves from the 17th century to the present.
Well, I was kind of frustrated with the idea, as Americans, we have this impulse to deny history, right? To cut people off from history, and it's a way of of maintaining this myth of meritocracy, of course, the myth of individualism. And I wanted to situate all of these figures in this long history. And the ideologies that result in the violence. And I was drawn to Darren Wilson. I say this in the introduction to the book. Darren Wilson's a police officer who killed Michael Brown.
Yeah.
Describes, now these two men are exactly the same size, weight, and height, right? But the police officer describes Michael Brown as this demon rising up before him. And I started thinking, Christina Sharp and Claudia Rankine and a lot of people have written about the fear, the police officer's fear is the thing that is really animating this, and the fear around Tituba and sort of beginning to make these connections. Seeing how, in some ways, the American legal system is a machine for rationalizing fear.
Yeah.
Right? Whether or not there is something that actually takes place, fear precedes and is justified through the process of through this legal process. And so, I've always maintained that poetry, everything is possible in poetry, and so this is the place where I wanted to do this work of trying to find stories and find a way to convey, or to rather make legible, the logic that informs all of this.
Yeah.
It's an impossible task, but it's a very motivating task.
Well, but there's something. I mean, I do think everything is possible in poetry, just part of my envy of you all who are poets, but because there's this sort of, the distinction between fiction and nonfiction is completely disrupted. Everything is available, including the imagination. But that actually describes what existing is like, right? That's what life is. And so there are these theaters, and you have, right, they're throughout the book, they're theater selfies. I love that concept. You have several poems that are theater selfies, right?
Yeah.
That are where you're reflecting on yourself. But it is, there's a collapse of the sort of the reality of being in a theatrical performance and the theater of life and the courtroom as a site of theater that has coercive and effect, right? So it's not as though the theater is fictional. The theater is actually what we live.
Right. So we started talking a little bit back in the Cullman Center about, there's one theater selfie. There are 3 poems in the book called Theater Selfie. And there's one about, so people often ask, was that true? Did this really happen? And I say, it doesn't matter whether or not it happened. It doesn't matter if, we don't say, is a painting true? It's art.
It's art, right.
But this actually happened to some extent. So my wife had a conflict with a neighbor, and the neighbor reported us to DIFUS. And so at some point we have this social worker entering our house and to inspect our home for the safety of the children. And the characters in the play, so the poem is constructed as a play, and the characters are Greg, Ginger, Fita, and Sarah, but they're also not us, because as I'm constructing this play, I'm thinking about the dynamics of government imposition within domestic spaces of people of color. That's what I'm most interested in.
Right.
Yeah. And so collapsing the realities while trying to make some critique on the larger social fiction.
It's a devastating piece, and there's levity, right? Because you're right, because both of you are these sort of brilliantly incisive, critical moments about what's actually happening. But it's devastating because it is true.
True. Yeah. And this is also one of the things I'm really interested in the book in general is, we live in this moment of non-truth and mistruths. And so I wanted to also interrogate our relationship to truth and the ways that it can be, the ways that it is manipulated, right? The extent to which our lives are curated by various powers.
You have a moment where one of the social workers says, well, you talked about this event differently in this poem than you did in your description, right? Like those,
yeah. So the ways that we narrate ourselves, right?
Yeah.
The stories that we tell about who we are different depending on the different contexts. And so, there was one of the reviews that Salvatore mentioned. I think the reviewer said the book, that I was engaged in a kind of critical self-theory. Right. So the illusion being critical race theory, of course, but critical self-theory, which I thought was kind of really interesting, because I am interested in the ways that critical race theory affords us this kind of macro view on society. What is critical self-theory? Well, that is a way of thinking about the self that is, I would like to think, a step aside from the narcissistic.
And you get to that question. This is, as the kids say, there's a lot that's meta.
Yeah.
Right. In the book, right? Because there are also poems where where that questions, where you, there's one in particular where you are replicating the kinds of questions that get asked about what it means for you, and particularly for you as a Black person, to be engaged in this sort of work of self-reflection, right? And to center yourself, and the question about the legitimacy of your voice speaking about you.
Again, true story,
Right.
right? I
Yeah.
was giving a reading, I forget where, but a young man in the audience said, asked, do you ever get self-conscious, or does it ever bother you that, no, do you ever feel guilty
Right.
for using your past selves in your poem, for exploiting, you might say, exploiting your past selves in poems?
Right.
And I was just so fascinated by this question.
question.
And, you know, there's a very clear generational
Sure.
difference in thinking there. And, you know, but as a teacher, I wanted to understand where he was coming from. And so what does it mean? And again, I think it falls into this notion of separating people from their histories, so that
Yeah.
there's the illusion of it's just me right here, right now, and whatever I have is what I earned and did on my own. Exactly,
That's
right.
right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, I'm kind of interrogating this relationship to past selves at the same time, right? What is true about me in the past versus what I have concocted about myself in the past, and, you know, to what extent is that legitimate, et cetera, et cetera.
And you sort of, and how we would say it in Alabama, you kind of get him told, right? Right, you tell him about it. I mean, there's the poem is a response that is.
Yeah.
I think that, and I sort of throughout, I think what is part of what is remarkable is that you respond to moments of, I think, what are frankly sort of insult and unabashed racism at various moments, not dispassionately, right? So that there's clearly frustration, anger, offense, but with curiosity attached to it, right?
Yeah. So this is the privilege of growing up with my parents as parents, right, and being sort of empowered in the ways that I was and continue to be. It just, for a long time, just didn't occur to me that someone could think these things about me.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And so it was such a mystery. And so I it had always been, I had always begun in curiosity, and it's like, why? I don't
How could that
understand.
be?
How could that be?
Yeah.
And I think that's also, what fascinates me about the monsterization of Black people and just people of color in general. But thinking about this young man, and actually, I've lost myself in the reverie of,
Yeah.
but not responding dispassionately.
Yeah.
I think I am interested in recovering these relationships.
Sure. Right.
Right. And there's a place for, dismissing, cutting off the toxic interaction. I reject that out of hand, and I reject you out of hand, and right. There's a place for that. But I'm really curious of what happens afterwards. So in particular, there's one of the theater selfies is I'm going to the Richard Rodgers Theater to buy tickets for Hamilton for my daughter. And I know it's going to cost me outrageously.
Oh, yeah.
But I get to the window and I say, yes, I'd like to buy tickets. And I had seen in the online
right.
that there were some seats available months in advance, in advance. But the guy in the window says, he just assumes, he says, well, first of all, he says there are no tickets, and we kind of go back and forth, and he says, well, I said, there are tickets in March. He says, yeah, but you can't. And he catches himself. And we all know what he's meaning to say. He knows what he's meaning. I know what he's meaning to say. And it is actually a profoundly intimate moment.
Yes.
Right? We know each other so intensely that there is no escape from the dialogue that we are trapped within.
Yes.
And so one reaction could clearly very easily be, I could blow up and display my rage and but another reaction, which I can explore in poetry,
I love it.
is to think, how do we reconcile this relationship? How do we how do we make civilized people out of these two figures? Right? The one who has been harmed.
Yes.
And the one who has the harmful views. And so I wanted to imagine a scenario in which they find some way of meeting minds. The issue, though, as I was writing the poem, is I couldn't figure out a way through that without the black man doing the emotional labor.
Right. Well, that's the difficulty, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I love the use you describe that moment as intimate, which I think is part of sort of the key to what works throughout it, because there is, even with these sort of specters, there is intimacy in this language of race, right? Or in this, right? And that we sort of have this, I think, one of the unfortunate things is that Americans have this sort of Pollyanna-ish sort of account that, if we all just were close up to each other, it wouldn't be so violent, which is actually all of the moments are very close up. But for me, part of what you do that allows that to be explored is that you disrupt the distinctions that are often made between the intellectual and the emotional, right? That those things are always deeply wedded, right? So you don't have to sort of analyze this. You don't have to give up feeling, or the other way, right? To sort of deal with the sort of complexity of feeling, you don't have to pretend that there isn't this question, right? We're two people who are standing in front of each other, trying to work out this kind of funky dynamic.
Right.
And also, I want tickets for my child to see Hamilton, right? There's also the end.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. There's also the expediency.
Yeah.
And it's not just race, right? And so this is the
class
kind
too,
of
yeah.
it's class. But also we know this dynamic, and I'm looking at my daughter. We know this dynamic in families as well. Right? I know what you're thinking. You know what I'm thinking.
Oh, all the time.
You know, and so there's that kind of intimacy. Is also kind of represented, or what's the word? There's microcosmic of these larger social political intimacies.
Yeah, because you have, I mean, the black man says, well, you have kids, right? That becomes the moment. That's the bridge moment.
This is right, yeah. This is what we have in common.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm the frustration in the poem, and I think the frustration in general is, no, it's not a frustration. I take that back. I'm calling it a frustration now. But I think what I'm trying to do throughout the book is to demonstrate a kind of reflection. In didactic poetry tells you what to think, right? It says that you must believe this and you must feel this way. And I wanted to explore poetry that was deeply interested in how an individual processes these moments. And not privileging Darren Wilsons of this dyad. And so hopefully, of course, I'm a big fan of psychotherapy and right and this kind of practice, and so I'm kind of using the Greg character throughout the book as kind of philosophical tool for exploring the dynamics of this kind of self-interrogation, right? Is there a way? What kinds of peace can be achieved through if everyone were engaged in these kinds of self-reflections, right? And I think it's all too easy, and we're all too conditioned to point the camera outward and to lay blame outward, right?
So the Greg character is also shaped by, so there's history, but there's also inheritances and family and ancestors, right? So there's parents and grandparents and ancestors, more broadly speaking, who, and tell me if this isn't right, but it's almost, it reads to me as though they're haunting Greg, right? Even as, sort of blackness is haunting the country, and right, and at work in sort of, that's part of the process of reflection is these voices of those who came before, or presences, right?
Yeah. So our ancestors are uniformly, I think, and rightly, of course, celebrated, and we carry them in our heads, and there's a way in which the accomplishments, and I was telling you about my grandfather, there's a way in which the accomplishments of our ancestors are not entirely, empowering. They can be intimidating, and right. And so you're carrying this burden, this obligation, and so I wanted to, and I think also kind of humanize, right, the ancestors, because they had full range of expression and personality and character, and within that range was very possibly, most certainly actually, resentments and angers and so this is also something I explored in the in Air Traffic, the memoir.
Beautifully,
thanks. Thinking about the sort of humanizing the father by allowing him his faults. Right, and I think this is also something I'm trying to do with our ancestors writ large, is understanding them as full characters. Yeah.
And you, so there's sort of more of a, I don't know, maybe a sort of a craft question with respect to that, because part of the way that I think that works, as for me as a reader, is in the detail, right? Of both gesture, but also the visual register, right? So we actually sort of imagine this sort of the kind of animated landscape of their lives in a way. Are you? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the land is always, geography is always a character,
right?
And well, this is the beauty of having been a Cullman Fellow, was that I got to spend so much time thinking about all the minutiae, right, and the great details around the lives of some of these figures. And as a homeowner and someone who participates in that, I think a lot. I'm often thinking about the ways that black folks have been dispossessed from land, right? And so there's the land itself, imagining the land and locating true spaces, in the poems, is also a way of reclaiming.
Oh,
right? if not a proprietorial relationship, certainly a privileged relationship to space.
Yes. Yeah. I'm going to tuck away. There's something that I'm going to use. And relatedly, there's some documents, and so land, but also architecture, right? And also sort of documentation, right? So I'm thinking about, you have a slave ship and a slave ship model and a theater together on one page, for example. Talk a little bit about,
So the poetry fans in the house will know it's in fashion to do erasure poems, right? These things are very popular, and I wanted to engage in the form of the day. And again, the privilege of being here, I would go through and find all these documents, and some of the most. Robin Cost Lewis talks about the erasure poems. She says there are kind of two ways to think about it, and I think there are more, but she's interested in the erasure poem is you take the page of some text and you redact, you black out various parts of the text in order to suggest a hidden text within that text, or a hidden message within that text. And somehow the redaction poem and the original text are in conversation. There's another form of that where who cares what the original text is? You're just using that as a canvas to find new poems. And as I was going through thinking about these erasure poems, and I very much wanted to be in conversation with these documents and the actual texts. Some of them were just absolutely horrifying. The stuff I found and came across, and in that practice, I was pulled into the visual dimensions of text as well. So Imani's referring to this image of which I coincidentally sort of noticed. It's actually a cathedral.
Oh, right.
It is the layout of the blueprint layout of a cathedral and the slave ship, famous image of the slave ship. And they look very similar, right? Just the outlines of them. And the relationship between them, there is some erasure happening. And I didn't want to interfere with the images. And so I just left them as they were. To think about the kinds of erasures that are already embedded.
Yeah, you think about sort of the contours of anything, right? What we fill them with that can actually sort of determine what the experience of being inside actually is, right? So they look similar, but obviously quite different.
But they have histories.
They're interconnected. They're deeply interconnected,
we'll
right?
say.
Yes, they're intimately intertwined. Yeah. How would you describe? I keep using the term book, but what form?
Interesting, yeah.
I don't know. Maybe like the architecture of what you've done. It's formally really distinctive, right? So there, you could say, there's a play, and there are images, and there are and there are documents, and there are encounters, and there are memories.
Well, so our friend Era D. Matthews has her book Bread and Circus does a lot of this work, and there are a number of poets whose books bring in documents and images, and so I was also thinking about this different ways of constructing a book, of organizing a book, but the obsessiveness of my mind kind of latched on to this theme of the spectrality and the haunting, and just kept finding resonances from one poem to another poem to a later poem. And then as I was writing the book, I would want to comment on earlier things that I had written.
Right.
And so it ends up being this kind of, hermeneutic kind of process of reading, interpreting, adding to, accruing new information. And
Because it's also sort of, I mean, it's cultural criticism too. It's philosophy too. It's
you can do anything in a poem.
Right.
A poem, yeah.
If you do it right, well, if you do it well, right? I mean, it's
Within reason.
I want to allow you all an opportunity to ask questions to start to think of them, but I do want to ask, take the privilege of asking about gender.
Yeah.
Because it's a theme.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to ask any more than that. I want to just ask how for you does gendering, and particularly the role of women in the text, shape your sense of the spectral? Because it's another dimension.
Yeah, so the connection, my mother and my aunt in the front row, and I think this is my nightmare scenario here. But I was thinking about the ways that women are monsterized, right? In the way that the men that we referred to earlier are monsterized, and I'm writing the book in the Me Too moment.
Yeah.
And I had just written a memoir about my father who had some rather loathsome ideas about gender. And again, this kind of inward thing where how do I reconcile my relationship with all of this junk, all of this toxic junk?
Yeah.
And so the book is both in this self-critical theory manner, is both a kind of, and I don't want to claim that I'm free of it. I've done the work, but I am suggesting a kind of way of doing that work, right? That translates into race and translates into other dimensions. And I'm avoiding the question, aren't I?
You are, yes. Well, can I ask this? Maybe let me ask a slightly nuanced version of it. Because you talk about sort of the monsterization of Black people and people of color, but you're also doing something with how beauty functions for women as a kind of distortion of something. Yeah.
That. So the way that we project beauty onto women is as obscuring as right any of the other monsterizing dynamics. And I am interested in how just as I was saying, the humanity of our ancestors. How do I, as an American male, lift the Vaseline-covered lens, and depict? And I think so. A conversation I often have with other male poets is, how do we write about this? It's impossible to write. You can't write about it. You just don't. Give up. Leave it alone. It's the third rail. You're never going to win. I can't do that.
Thank you, though. It's important to not do that.
It's important to not do that.
Yeah.
Right? And no, it's not. I have no illusions of, achieving some nirvana in the relationship to gender, but I want to put that work on the page. I wanted to think about ways of representing that investment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I get off the hot seat now?
I guess. Let's see. Okay, we'll go to audience questions. Oh, here's one. Well, will you read a stanza or two so we can hear a poem or part of one of the poems in your voice, the sound and texture?
Absolutely.
Okay. Please
Thank you.
ignore all of the markings in there, but I was
No worries.
very impacted by.
Oh. Do you have a suggestion, a recommendation? Request?
I'd like you to choose.
You want me to choose?
Yes.
Okay. Let's read the Tituba poem then.
Yes. Wonderful.
The title is Occult.
Oh, I love that.
Zero your scales to the burden of a lash, dear Justice. But let Tituba clumsy the magistrate's minds with a wag of her wizened index. A flight risk near forests of the Wampanoag, where Christians savaged Queen Weedamo's corpse. What else might Tituba, non-white and woman, haunt but a margin of error? She's a catbird's song trapped in the chimney. She's egg whites in water. She is the tumescence of smoke. Dear Mami Wata, let Tituba prove to be the stone that splits the stream of their vision. Let her renounce sight and be unseen. Let her cough ground coral in the shedding of a pewter moon, that she, of all the innocents, should live. Dear three-headed Hecate, replace her, the unthought thought, with wax, twigs, horsehair, and straw. Let her not appear as a witness, nor as evidence. As with the talking dog, let her be the hoodoo that speaks through their mirrors. Let a hang thread skein of yarn ghost the floorboards, tempting a red cat, his familiars, the devil, and his counsel, the canary. Let her conjure the man in black they fear, who charms pilgrims on the road to paradise, disguised as a harmless birdwatcher. Dear Nemesis, let her feed the court a few names from his register, a taste of her truth, her mise en abîme, her one hell that calls forth another. With no standing on her own behalf, let her sit in judgment. Let this power invested of gavel and oath help her give birth through her mouth like a god. So, thanks. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's a lot of allusions in the poem.
Yes.
Yeah, there's some Lucille Clifton there. There's a play on the brother who was a bird watcher in Central Park.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
And it's an incantation.
And it's an incantation. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Calling on the ancestors.
Yes.
Yes.
I think appropriate to that poem, this question, what went into finding the voice of each character, including land, objects, etc.? Do you find these voices differ or tell the same story, investigate the same curiosities?
Yeah, so the book starting with this kind of foundational question, do you ever feel guilty exploiting your former selves for poems, right, is I'm also kind of preoccupied throughout the book with this question of appropriation, right? And the idea of writing in the voice of someone else, right, should not fly given the current kind of politics. But I can't do that, right? And so how then do we not represent one another, but represent the way that we perceive one another, right? And I think that's the logic that I'm trying to get at. And so when I'm representing someone else, I am also conscious of the fact that it's my voice I'm projecting, right? And I'm not pretending that I have truthfully captured or rendered another person, because that person begins in my head. And so the voices, right, are very much my own.
So are they, okay, but I'm wondering, I think that seems to me to be a gracious and politic way of responding to that question, but you are filling, I mean, there's such care with filling up those voices, right? I mean, you're not just you're not just like saying it's, I'm not representing, but you're actually you're trying to attend to people in that process, right? Or others, or the relationship, right? Or
I guess yes, and what I'm saying is that that effort is kind of conditioned and contextualized by my self-consciousness about that relationship.
Yeah. That's beautiful. This is an advice question. What advice would you give to the non-English social science, specifically, doctoral student interested in melding critical self-theory, autoethnography, poetry, and the question of truth? Small question. It's a fantastic question.
It's a fantastic question. Yeah. And I think the way that you've already, and I know this tends to be the kind of cop-out response, but the way that you've constructed the question already suggests that you've done some thinking in bringing these elements together, right? And I think the way that we talk about poems in the poetry workshop, the way that we talk about texts in creative writing workshop, I think our colleagues down the other end of the hall, the scholars, would benefit greatly from being in those conversations. We are often, our creative writers are often in those in the scholarly conversations, right? But there's often a kind of mystification of creative writers as they do that spooky stuff down there, and I don't know how it's made, and but I would like to get our colleagues, our scholarly colleagues, into the creative writing workshop. I wanted to say, there was something else I wanted to say about that.
Can I?
Please,
follow up, because I think the question of truth is really interesting, right? But like, because we treat the sort of different kinds of data so differently, right? So that there's sort of the data that we live with, the sort of encounters, is a kind of empirical evidence, right? When we talk to people, right? But then there are certain kinds of, in the social science world, there's kinds of empirical evidence that is seen as sort of more.
And even in history,
yes,
within the humanities, there are ways of thinking, and I guess that's the kind of the irreverent benefit of being a poet, is that I can wade into these disciplines without needing to have the expertise or the training. Right, which is both liberating and frustrating, I think, for a lot of my colleagues as well. So would the suggestion be in part to do some poetry? Do some poetry, yeah. I think think so this question of autoethnography comes up a lot, and what was the Audre Lorde's book? My Name, was it?
Zami.
Zami. So there are models already of people doing kind of autoethnography and thinking about the self as I say, microcosmic of these larger social dynamics. And so I don't think it's as unusual a concept as we tend to make it out to be.
Okay, here's another one. You did a lot of research for this book. What was your most exciting discovery? And then there's another question tacked on. What did you leave out of the book?
So anybody, other writers in the room know that once the due date is coming up, the imagination kicks into high gear, and right. And so there was a lot that I learned in the last few months before they snatched it out of my hands. And I think I clearly wanted to do more work on the gender thread throughout the book. The long poem which you're referring to is thinking about colorism, and I wanted to think about that in a way that would allow me to talk about the poem in a more comprehensive manner than I am now. So there was that, and there was also poems, the incantations, because there are a few poems in the book that I call charms. Yes. And they are kind of tongue-in-cheek ways of suggesting how we can get around sort of the book banning and the denial of Black history, and right. And so again, this kind of the incantation, and this was another thing that I wanted to explore more, but was kind of at the end of the genesis of the book. Yeah.
They also read to me as ways, I mean, it makes, when you said that, made me think of what you were saying about growing up with your parents. The charms also strike me as ways of getting around being completely diminished by being made into a monster.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's right.
They're tools for living, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So they're tongue in cheek and a little spiteful, but fun. But yeah, I think at the root they are self-empowering. Yeah.
Okay. Were you reading poetry while working on these poems? If so, what?
That's a poet asked that question. What was I reading? Well, I include a very partial reading list, but I don't include many of the poets I was reading during time. And that's a fool's game. I'm not going to fall for it. I'm not going to start naming poets, and so
it's just right. Well, here's a question that this is the last one. I saved it for the last intentionally because I think it's a fascinating question. How do we keep ancestors whole?
So I think this is the work that I'm trying to do in the book is the very work that some on the right are so vehemently trying to prevent from happening, and that's basically the whole and honest look at our collective history, right? And because these figures have been forced to exist in the ways that we talk about, our ancestors, and they haven't been given their full recognition in at what we know as American history, right? And so I think wherever there's a book ban, there is an indication that there is something to hide, and there is some self-consciousness, and there is a fear of awareness. And I think making ancestors whole to make ancestors whole is to imagine collectively, publicly, who they were and what their experiences were like.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And amazing. And books are for sale, and you will be signing.
I will be happily signing.
Wonderful.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
So,
Thanks.
thank you.